Hello, අයුබෝවන්. ඉතින් අපි මම කිව්වා වගේ military technology and geopolitics කියන series එකක් අරන් එනවා. හැබැයි මේ series එකට එන expert ලංකාවේ මේ සම්බන්ධයෙන් ඉන්න ඉහළම expert කෙනෙක්. එකම දේ ඔහුට සිංහල පොඩ්ඩක් අමාරුයි. ඒක හින්දා මට මේ interview කරන්න වෙන්නේ English වලින්. interview එකක් මම නෙමෙයි ඒක podcast එකක් ඇත්තටම. ඉතින් අපි දෙන්නම ගොඩක් කතා කරයි. නමුත් මේක English වලින් කරන්න වෙන්නේ. බලමු මම උපරිම උත්සාහයක් දෙන්නම් ඔයාලට මේක පුළුවන් තරම් සරල ඉංග්‍රීසියෙන් පවත්වන්න. ඒ වගේම අපි ඉස්සරහට පොඩි ටෙක්නොලොජි එකක් අත්හදා බලනවා මේ දවස්වල ඉංග්‍රීසි පොඩ්කාස්ට් එකක් කොහොමද ලයිව් සිංහල සබ්ටයිටල් එක යන්නේ කියලා. මෙහෙම ඒක Facebook එකේ සිංහල සබ්ටයිටල් සපෝට් කරනවා. නමුත් YouTube එකේ තාම හරියටම සිංහල සබ්ටයිටල් සපෝට් කරන්නේ නැහැ. but අපි රිසර්ච් කරන ටෙක්නොලොජි එක හරි ගියොත් මට ඔයගලන්ට ඒක දෙන්න පුළුවන්. ඒතකොට ඒක අතන බ්‍රවුසර් ප්ලගින් එකක් වගේ තමයි ගොඩක් වෙලාට හම්බ වෙන්නේ. නමුත් ඒක දැනට available නැහැ. ඉතින් දැනට පොඩ්ඩක් අපිත් එක්ක රැඳිලා ඉන්න වෙනවා. ඉතින් කොහොමත් ජියෝපොලිටික්ස් සහ මිලිටරි ටෙක්නොලොජි ගැන කතා කරන මේ පොඩ්කාස්ට් සීරීස් එක මේ විදිහට තමයි යන්නේ. එකම දේ අද ඇවිල්ලා ඉන්න නිලන්තන් නිරුතන්. ඉතින් එයාගේ ක්වොලිෆිකේෂන් සහ එයා මේකට සුදුසු වෙන්නේ ඇයි කියන එක අපි එයාගෙන් අහමු. ඔයාලා පුදුම වෙයි. ඔහු ඇත්තටම ලංකාව වෙනුවෙන් කරලා තියෙන දේවල් දැනගත්තා. Hi Niruthan. Oh, I would say Nilan.
Hi,
so
how are you?
We normally converse. I call him Nilan.
Yes, please. So Nilan would make me feel a lot more welcome.
Yes,
Thank you.
yes. I think it's your first name, right? Your first name, no?
It is, yes. Nilanthan, yes.
Yes, cool. Okay. So tell us a little bit about yourself. Without me introducing, I would like to hear it from you.
Okay, so I am the executive director of a think tank here called the Center for Law and Security Studies. So it's one of the premier defense think tanks in the country at the moment. I'm also a lecturer at the National Defense College. So that's the highest institute of military education in the country. It's for senior officers of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and police. I also teach at a few other places like the Diplomatic Training Institute and Kotalawala Defense University, KDU. And I typically write on geopolitics and military technology. So I have a column on a defense platform called Strat News Global, and I also write for many universities like Yale and Johns Hopkins, Columbia. So all of them have published my work in some form or the other. But ultimately, I let you and your audience be the judge of how good I am at my job, right?
Yes. Actually, I'm kind of proud to have you on board because of the level that you work in within Sri Lankan defense establishment. For example, all of our highest top-level military brass from all three forces are kind of learning from you in a sense. Am I correct?
Yes, that would be right. Yes.
Okay. So where did you grow up? How did you get into defense technology and geopolitical lecturing? Tell me a little bit about yourself.
The personal story, right. So I was born and raised in Chennai in India. So my family is originally from Jaffna, and we were targeted by the insurgents at that time because one of the things that organizations like LTT and TELO did was they wanted to get rid of all the patriotic Sri Lankan Tamils first. So my grandfather was assassinated, and then my family had to flee the country and all that. So I grew up in Chennai. By the time I came back, the LTT had been wiped off, and I just finished a master's
Assassinated by
degree
whom?
in
Your
international
grandfather assassinated by whom?
By TELO.
Oh. Okay, so all these armed military groups that were active in that period.
Exactly. So at that time, we've got to remember that there were a number of different insurgent groups active, and they then killed each other off. So the LTT was basically the last man standing, but they committed very brutal atrocities against each other as well, with torture camps being set up and huge firefights and all that. It's one of the unwritten, bloodiest episodes in sort of the last 60 or 70 years of our country's history.
Okay.
So then I came back. I worked for the UN for about 2 years. The direction that they wanted to go was not particularly the direction that I wanted to go. I was more interested in security, the national interest, geopolitics, and things like that. So then I started working for the Bandaranaike Center for International Studies, And then my mentor, Dr. Harinda Vidanage, started getting me a lot of opportunities to teach at military institutions and all that. So it's just been a step-by-step growth process.
I didn't get the last part. What we're saying? Harinda,
I said
Harinda
it's just been a
Vidanage.
step-by-step growth
Yeah.
process.
Okay, cool. So if I get this correctly, you are a person from Jaffna, and you fell victim to the conflict that happened in the north, and then you came back to Sri Lanka, and now you are advising and discussing, teaching, sharing knowledge on military technology with our military. Is that correct? If I put it that way?
Yeah, yes, that's correct. Well, my family was affected by the war. I was born in Chennai, so it's my family who really had to suffer.
Okay. So this is for you. This is for the audience. So you දැන් ඔයගලන්ට තේරෙනවා ඇති ලංකාවේ ඩිෆෙන්ස් කියන්නේ 3 forces වලට ඇඩ්වයිස් කරන්නේත් අපේම රටේ පුරවැසියෝ ජාතිය සම්බන්ධයෙන් කිසිම ඩිස්ක්‍රිමිනේෂන් එකක් නැහැ. අපි හැමෝම ශ්‍රී ලාංකිකයෝ. දැන් ඔබලට තේරෙනවා ඇති ලංකාවේ සමහර කොටස් ජාතිවාදය පදනම් කරගෙන කොච්චර වැරදි අදහසක ඉන්නවද කියලා. කොටිම අපි ආමියකටත් ඒ ඇඩ්වයිසර්ස් ඒ ඩිෆෙන්ස් ස්ට්‍රැටජිස් ඒව හදනකොට මේ එහෙම ජාතිය එහෙම මොකක් බලන්නේ නැහැ. ඒක ඒ අවස්ථාවේ තියෙන ප්‍රශ්නේ මොකද්ද? ඒකට විසඳුම ගැනීම පමණයි. ඒ විදිහේ බ්‍රෝඩ් දේවල් ලංකාවේ ගොඩාක් සිද්ධ වෙනවා. එකම දේ අර දේශපාලනිකව මේ ප්‍රශ්න වැඩි කරගන්න මේ උලුප්පල දක්වන්නේ මේ කොහෙද තියෙන වැරද්දක් කරන එක ලොකු කරලා පෙන්නනවා. හැබැයි ඊට වඩා මේ අපේ ජාතීන් කොච්චර සමගියෙන් දැනටත් සහ ඉස්සරත් වැඩ කරනවාද කියන එකට හොඳ උදාහරණයක් නිලන්. ඉතින් ඒකත් මතක තියාගෙන අපි ඊළඟ ප්‍රශ්නෙට යමු. ප්‍රශ්නේ කියන්නේ අපි අදහසට යමු. So Nilan, I wanted to talk about especially in this series as a start, I wanted to get military technology as opposed to global politics. Global politics we will come back in a later episode. But in this specific episode, I want to discuss about what's happening globally, especially what kind of technologies have been used in the Russian and Ukrainian war that has been happening right now. And we see a lot of tension between these countries, especially Putin, a couple of weeks ago, maybe a few days back also, started launching some hypersonic missiles, and the West is now kind of panicked about that. And since they don't seem to have anything to counter that weapons that are being deployed by Russia at this moment. Is it true? Do they really do not have anything to counter the hypersonics? And what kind of hypersonics are we talking about from the Russian side?
So, first of all, it is true that you don't have a comprehensive defense system against hypersonic missiles. So, if it's one or two, you can take them down. But the problem is what happens when an enemy with a lot of stockpile targets you in a coordinated way. Your air defenses tend to get overwhelmed and things like that. And in general, when we're talking about intercontinental ballistic missiles, so what the Russians tested out is supposed to be an interregional, intermediary range ballistic missile, right? So an intercontinental ballistic missiles, which the Russians also have, there is no defense for that. But the Russians have no defense against the American ICBMs either. So ultimately, it's the concept of deterrence and the idea that you and I will not go to war if it's unsafe for both of us. That's what is actually holding things from spilling over. But there's no physical defense per se against intercontinental ballistic missiles. Now, to just come to your question, Russia has already started using hypersonic missiles, but the one that we saw a few weeks ago was not the first one. They've been using short and medium range hypersonic missiles for a while now in Ukraine. The success rate, I would say, is about 75%. So basically, the Ukrainians have said that they managed to intercept about a quarter of the Russian hypersonic missiles. And typically, this is done with the help of American missile defense platforms like the Patriot or the Aegis or something like that. But the problem with hypersonic weapons is that they travel so quickly and they can change targets and trajectory very quickly as well. So it's not the direct speed of it itself which is the main threat. It's the fact that it can quickly change its course and catch you by surprise, which is really sort of giving the West a hard time. But to be honest, as I was saying, Russia does not have sophisticated missile defense systems against the enemy's hypersonic missiles either. So if the United
Does
States
US have
wanted to
hypersonics?
Oh, yeah. So the United States, Russia, China, and so a little bit of France, but there are doubts over whether that's fully functional. And India have the BrahMos. So that's sort of the big four at the moment when it comes to hypersonic missiles. These are the four countries who have them. I must caution our audience, though, there's also an argument that says that hypersonic missiles are overrated. So we must not make the mistake of assuming that every new technology which is fancy will end up being the technology of the future. A lot of people have pointed out that the value given by hypersonic weapons can very easily be replaced with existing technology as well. So right now, even though this is a very interesting theoretical debate, we still have no idea whether hypersonic missiles will actually become very popular in the future.
Okay, so what I have heard is that the intercontinental ballistic missiles and hypersonics operate in different ways. For example, the intercontinental ballistic missile would go out of the Earth's atmosphere to a certain extent and come back in a ballistic trajectory like this, right? When you're coming back, there will be multiple warheads that disassemble themselves and find their individual targets, right, on a region that they have earlier specified. So since it has a predictable ballistic route or a path, it is easy for the countries defending can see the incoming warheads or incoming projectiles, and they can target them because they won't change course, and you can hit them head on. But the hypersonics we are talking about right now, they kind of don't go into that higher atmosphere. They're kind of maybe like few thousand feet off the ground, maybe 10,000 feet, 20,000 feet off the ground, and then they suddenly appear over the horizon, and there is no time for you to react because of the speed as well as you said, changing of the direction. So I would say that since you said that even ballistics, intercontinental ICBMs even don't have, I can't agree on that. Is that what you said? Or since it is like 60s, 70s technology anyway, there should be some sort of defense for that, right? For the ICBMs.
There are defenses. Yeah, there are defenses, but not to the point where you can protect yourself from a coordinated attack. So I'll give you an example, right? Mm-hmm. So North Korea has about, they say, a dozen or so intercontinental ballistic missiles. Russia has about 800 or so intercontinental ballistic missiles, right? So the US missile defense system, it's called the GMD, if I'm not mistaken. So if you look at the Department of Defense annual report that was published in 2022, the Department of Defense specifically says that this defense system is only meant to protect the United States from rogue missiles and stray missiles and countries with a small capacity, but that this is not meant to protect us from the PRC or from Russia, and that strategic
PRC means People's Republic of China, for the people who don't know.
Exactly. Sorry. So either China, this is not meant to be a comprehensive defense against China or Russia. And the DoD report specifically says strategic deterrence is still our biggest defense against a coordinated nuclear ICBM strike. Because at some point of time, your defense system will get overwhelmed. So the best way to defend yourself is to have one of those as well, to make sure that you and I don't really attack each other because we both get destroyed.
You mean MAD, mutually assured destruction?
MAD, exactly.
Okay. So that's quite the contrary of what we see on YouTube, right? So in YouTube and all those places, they don't talk about that part. I mean, even Russia, if it commits all its nuclear or whatever the missile arsenal, let's put a nuclear aside, if it commits all those missiles with a conventional warhead and launch all at once, even US does not have a defense mechanism to counter that, no? That's what you said, basically.
Yeah. So if it's non-nuclear, they might be able to counter it because the Americans have a lot of quantity as well. So you've got to remember that a lot of this is also about interception and spotting the incoming threat. So the Americans on the East Coast, they have sensors. On the West Coast, they have
And they have
sensors.
satellites
They
anyway
have
overlooking
satellite-
Russia. Yeah.
Exactly. So knowing when the missile is going off, you will know that in seconds. Of course, now there are new challenges like nuclear submarines and all that as well, which will complicate the issue. But if we're talking about typical missile launches, you will know within seconds. But the question is, can you intercept them? Where can you intercept them? What will the consequences be? So if you only have about 12 or 20 missiles in your stockpile, then of course the Americans can defend against it very easily. I mean, you have the THAAD, THAAT, right, which is one of the most
defense,
advanced.
Terminal high altitude defense, something.
Excellent, right? Terminal high altitude aerial defense.
Yes.
I mean, a gold star for you. So you have the Patriot, you have the Aegis. So you do have a lot of sophisticated missile defense systems that are capable of protecting the country. But the question is, what is the scale of the attack that you can protect the country from? And we don't have to believe YouTube channels. I believe the US Department of Defense, for them to say that this entire thing, and I think they've spent about $350 billion on this GMD program over the last 50 years or so. So they've spent a considerable amount of money on missile defense, because throughout the Cold War, this was the major security concern that they had, right? But even for them to explicitly say in their report, look, none of this is actually as valuable as strategic deterrence, I think that tells us a lot.
Yeah. So we have seen that Iran was 4 months ago fired some dummy missiles, I would say. I don't know whether they had warheads or not, just to prove a point to Israel. So Israel's defense system, as we all know, Iron Dome is a very popular one. It couldn't defend against all of them. What was the situation there? Could they have been defended, or did Iran not put its entire brunt of the weapons towards Israel? What happened there?
Yeah, so based on the sources that we read, I mean, you have the Israeli side that says that Israel only used a small amount of its defense systems. You have the Iranian side claiming that Iran only used a small amount. But ultimately, as you said, it was far more of a symbolic gesture. No actual damage was actually done. And if anything, I would say that it was a moral victory for Israel. And I'll tell you why. Because you had a whole number of Arab countries participating in the takedown of all those Iranian projectiles. What Iran ended up revealing to the world was that if there was a confrontation between Iran and Israel, the Arab countries will not be on Iran's side. Many Arab countries played a big role in taking down many of those projectiles. Of course, the West, they have their warships stationed to take it out and stuff like that, and Israel has its own defenses. But look, ultimately, the Iron Dome example is, I think, quite symbolic of the conversation that we've been having, right? So if you have a rocket that you can make for $200, and the counter missile that I have costs $200,000 or $100,000, there's obviously going to be a point where you will overwhelm me with numbers. So it's just that brutal mathematical numbers game which prevails here, where you reach what's called a saturation point, and beyond that you simply get overwhelmed.
Good point. So it's actually, at the end of the day, the economics of the two sides, right? If you run out of missiles, firing $100,000 per missile, then against a $200 missile, so rocket, I would say. So in that case, I have seen, especially US Navy ships in recent past, they have been experimenting with a laser deterrence, laser counter missile system, where they would, I saw this on Discovery as well as few other defense channels. So they could heat up a side of a missile using a laser beam and blast it off. So per shot, the cost is mere cents, sometimes few dollars, because of the massive amount of electricity required can be generated through nuclear propulsion on these warships. So where is the technology on that? Can't we defend incoming projectiles or missiles using laser technology?
We certainly can. And in fact, recently there was a company which got the green light for making a prototype for something called the Leonidas. Leonidas was basically, it's this shooting system which shoots out either multiple laser beams or a wave of, so these are called energy directed weapons. So we don't call them lasers and all that anymore. We've given them a boring academic
directed
name.
energy weapons. Yeah.
Exactly, right? So we need to make all this non-threatening so that we can get funding and all that. If we say lasers, people will freak out. So the weapons industry needs to come up with these non-threatening academic names. So, but they're essentially lasers. And this Leonidas, its main job is to take out drones. Because now when we look at drone warfare, which once again has essentially been revolutionized by the Russia-Ukraine war, and it's also revolutionized the Russia-Ukraine war as well. There's been a two-way impact. The drone has changed warfare, and the war has changed how we see drones as well. So basically, drones being used in coordinated attacks, what we call swarm attacks. So the Leonidas is basically meant to take those out. So it can take out a whole bunch of drones on the spot instantly for a very low cost, simply by using lasers. And you have the iron beam. I mean, I think you alluded to it earlier, where the cost was much lower and all that. I would say we are about a decade away from this being operationalized on a proper level. But once that happens, obviously missile defense and all that will be revolutionized again, right? So the problem with many of these paradigm breaking technologies is that we are forced to reinvent our strategies all the time.
Yes. So as a counter, it's like a game of hide and seek, right? You come up with a technology a little bit better than what is there now, and the other side will obviously figure out few months later that how to counter that. For example, for this laser beam defense. So when you are hit by a laser to a certain point in a missile and heat it up and then blow it up, so the people who designed the missile started to rotate the missile mid-flight. So you cannot actually heat up a single point, right? So that heat dissipates through a large area of the surface. Again, so those kind of counters can be introduced to make to balance the battlefield. So since we came to drones, so we have seen that a lot of man-made, or we would say, we call them IEDs when it's on the ground. So now kind of improvised drones are there in the Ukrainian war. Sometimes it's commercial drones, sometimes assembled. So what are the different types of drones being used in this war especially?
So right now, the major change is the use of commercial drones that you alluded to. So especially these
commercial drones that means drones that we can buy off the shelf from a shop, right?
Exactly. Stuff that can just be bought by anybody. They're typically these quadcopter type things. And you have these FPVs, first person viewers. So that nobody about 4 years ago would have predicted that this would be one of the deciding factors of the Russia-Ukraine engagements. And yet most of what we see happening right now is determined by, of course, heavy artillery is still the major strategic weapon that's being used. We can't exaggerate and say that drones have replaced heavy artillery, but they've certainly changed the way in which people have started thinking on the battlefield. So your surveillance capacity, your ability to lend supporting fire, your ability to take out targets in the night. So most drones these days in that war are being used at nighttime as well. So Zelensky just this year requested volunteer drone makers and entrepreneurs and all that to manufacture at least 1 million drones. And I think they surpassed that number quite easily.
Really?
And on the Russian side as well, yeah. And if you
so
think
suicide
that's
drones,
a lot,
one per soldier, it's like one per soldier.
Yeah. Remember, these are not just suicide drones these days. these are also grenade droppers. So what happens is you attach a grenade on a clamp and you have some trigger which opens up the clamp. So you can essentially go and drop grenades
How do you
as
pull
well.
the pin? How do you pull the pin?
So there's like a small contraption, which basically you need to factor in some kind of trigger like a torchlight or impact or something like that. And that pulls the pin and detaches the grenade. So it's a very
any 6-channel transmitter can do that, no?
Yeah, absolutely. And most of these are made in garages anyway. Most of these are not made with very sophisticated technology. This is all completely off the shelf. One problem they faced is that they have needed certain Chinese products to manufacture this entire thing. And that's been difficult. So they've had to smuggle it in and go through the arms embargo and all that. But now over the last 1 year, the Ukrainians have started producing them because think about it, right? The actual big revolution is none of this. It's 3D printing. And that revolution is what is creating a number of other revolutions in many, many domains, like drone warfare and all that. So even this contraption that I told you, which drops the grenade and holds the grenade and all that, are 3D printed. Most of the parts of the drone itself are either bought off the shelf or are 3D printed. So we see a number of different types of technologies now, all on this cusp of breaking through. And drone warfare is an example of all of them working in tandem together.
So how do you defend against a drone swarm like this?
Right now, they have these anti-drone guns. So electronic jamming right now
we have seen it in our military parades, especially on the Independence Day, that they keep this big gun with like a laser gun or something. What does it do actually?
So it jams the signal. So these are electronic jammers.
Have you used one?
Unfortunately not. I would love to though. So to anybody watching who could facilitate that. I mean, let's face it, right? Maybe as this channel gets bigger, we can start making certain demands as well. As this podcast gets bigger, your channel is big enough already. But my point is that these are currently the only real defense we have, where it jams the signal between the drone and the drone pilot. So the drone basically usually drops. But the problem is now you have a newer version of some of these commercially altered drones which go into autopilot. So even if you jam the signal, that thing still autonomously kind of reaches its target anyway. The most effective technique is to just hunt down drone pilots and kill them, which is what Russia is doing with Ukraine. Right. So once again,
how to find the drone pilot? He may be like 5 kilometers away.
So in some cases, yes, but the Russians also dispatch mobile drone hunting teams where their sensors will pick up something the instant they see some activity, and then they radio the coordinates to some kind of air power facility, and then long range air power takes those guys out. So being a drone operator is very, very dangerous for both the Ukrainians and the Russians. If anybody thinks that these are guys who just stay behind, the casualty rate is extremely high for drone operators. So we will see when we discuss many different types of technologies that often the best solution are the old-fashioned solutions. Just like how strategic deterrence is still our best defense against nuclear weapons, just taking out the drone pilots is still our best defense against drones, rather than all this electronic jamming and laser beams and all that. These things will get better as time progresses, but the old-fashioned tricks still work best.
But that old-fashioned tricks cost more, right? Because in order to get the location to a launch platform, maybe in the skies or maybe a faraway missile facility, they just have to fire a missile that's worth hundreds of thousands of dollars just to kill a pilot who's piloting a $100 drone, right?
Yeah, exactly. But as we've seen, the traditional methods are very good at demoralizing the new methods. So when we look at the United States and Afghanistan, right? The United States, let's say the United States spends X billion dollars every year. We let's face it, none of us know what the actual number is, no matter what public data says. So let's say they spend X billion dollars, right? If I was to ask you, looking at it from a vacuum, who would win? The largest, most powerful, and technologically superior military force in the world, or a bunch of goat farmers in Afghanistan? Anybody would say the sophisticated, superior army would win. But we know that they spent 20 years fighting there, and after 20 years they left, giving the country back to the very force that they came in to liberate the country from. So many of these human-based, human-centric forms of warfare are what still give us success on the battlefield. The actual techno-domain itself has been surprisingly ineffective, simply because wars are not being fought in that old way anymore. These days, wars have political pressures, legal pressures, diplomatic pressures, social and cultural pressures. Let's face it, the United States could have easily annihilated Afghanistan if it had dropped a few large bombs on it. But politically, they can't get away with doing that because they have a certain narrative that they need to uphold for their own interests. So these old-fashioned, as I was saying, not to repeat the point over and over again, those are still the most effective in my opinion.
Okay. So going old-fashioned, let's come back to missiles. So India has been really forthcoming in their technology, especially their rocket technology. They have went to the moon. They have one of the most cost-effective or the most cost-effective space program on the planet. And they have a lot of homegrown, home-built missiles as well. So what are their latest missiles and how it's going to affect the regional, especially we are in that region. So regional geopolitics, how it's going to affect the Indian missile, how it's going to be affected by the Indian missile technology.
Okay, so in general, the thing that we need to focus on the most is the BrahMos, because that is the proper hypersonic missile that India has and that you see a lot of media hype and talk about and all that.
What's
this
the range?
Is something. The range, so I mean, it depends. So it has intercontinental capabilities as well, if I'm not mistaken, what they are perfecting. So anything more than 5,500 kilometers would be intercontinental. Anything within that 3,000 to 5,500 kilometers would be intermediate range, and below that would be medium and short range. So this is supposed to have right now confirmed intermediate range, but if I'm not mistaken, they are almost done with an intercontinental version as well.
They have
right? But all
just Googled it, so they have an advanced version where they could go about 900 kilometers. That is like a medium range, no?
Yeah, that would be a medium range, but the prototype for the intermediate range one, if I'm not mistaken, is almost done, because the last time I checked, they were ready to upgrade to the next stage as well of development.
So this is a Russian technology originally, is it?
So okay, so there are certain components that, if I'm not mistaken, the French and the Russians did help with. I'll have to get back to you on that, on the specifics, because a lot of this is rumor and speculation as well. But the point is that it is, for all intents and purposes, symbolically an indigenous hypersonic weapon, which is what we need to take away from this, because this puts India in a completely new class of capabilities. And remember, the effectiveness of the weapon itself is not as important as the experience of putting one together and building one. So that's what people are underestimating here. It doesn't matter how effective this first version is. What matters is that they have now gone through the cycle of creating one, regardless of how effective it is. So it's the same. So for example,
basically they have the military industrial complex that is capable of coming out with a missile like this.
Exactly, right? And think of all the failed prototypes of the Americans and the Russians and the Chinese and all that before they got to this point. So some of your innovations will be useless, some of them will be game changers, some of them will be useless again. So in terms of the missile capabilities as well, we've also got to look at what they need to use it for. Right? So for instance, the United States needs a missile defense system and an offensive missile system for power projection. Now, if you look at our own country now, Sri Lanka does not need...
Let's detail the term power projection for the viewers.
So power projection is the idea that you are now sending a message to the rest of the world that you have a certain amount of strength, that you have a certain amount of power. And this in diplomacy is considered to be a very, very important part of how you deal with the world. If you want to be a superpower, you need to engage in power projection, as in you need to be able to show the world that you can mobilize your military power in any part of the world if you want to. So aircraft carriers are a good example. I mean, the primary purpose of aircraft carriers is not functional. It's for power projection, right? The primary purpose of nuclear weapons is not to actually use it. It's for power projection. So you have many things that you display and showcase to the rest of the world in order to send a message that you are not to be messed with. Because the way that many military strategists and the way that many armies around the world think in general is that if you project yourself to be strong, then others will think twice before messing with you. It's like how in nature, some of these brightly colored snakes are poisonous, right? So you know that you're supposed to sort of leave them alone. So that is a Darwinian power projection sort of example, I guess. So that's what power projection is. So in terms of India's now new position when it comes to missile technology and all that, it's this power projection aspect and what it needs to use it for, which is important. Currently, India does not see anything east of Malacca as being in its immediate military interests. And so, for instance, if China invades Taiwan tomorrow, there's no guarantee that India will consider that to be a direct threat to any Indian interests, so to speak. So you don't really need intercontinental ballistic. Of course, India would want to get intercontinental ballistic missiles, and India has intercontinental ballistic missiles, not hypersonic missiles, but India does have intercontinental ballistic missiles. So if you're a small country like us, however, do we need intercontinental ballistic missiles? Or should we be happy with short range and medium range ballistic missiles? These are all the basic questions that come into play when we look at the effectiveness of it. So if we had something like the Iron Dome, or if we wanted something like the Iron Dome, my question would be why? Why would we need to spend so much money on countering a threat which is not really a threat for us? I'm a big fan of coming up with indigenous defensive strategies based on our local sort of threat matrix. So Taiwan, for instance, has something called the porcupine strategy. In case China invades Taiwan, Taiwan wants to become as prickly as possible, like a porcupine, to make it almost impossible for China to have a swift run-in. So that's an indigenous Taiwanese strategy developed for Taiwan's unique problem. The Iron Dome was an indigenous Israeli strategy to deal with the unique Israeli problem, which is hundreds and hundreds of rockets, cheap rockets, being fired in. So yes, India has the BrahMos and a lot of military technology and all that, but I would say that it's the power projection aspect which is important for India rather than the mathematical capabilities per se of these missiles.
Well, just read about BrahMos a little bit while we were speaking. So the launch platform for BrahMos is either can be an aircraft or artillery or even a sea ship. So that means even though it has a limited range as of now, the platforms can get it through to the very close to the enemy territory, and then release it just outside, and it will have the range to go and hit the target.
Yeah,
Okay.
so this is called nuclear triad. This is called a nuclear triad capability, where you can launch nuclear force from the land, the sea, or the air. And right now, there are very, very few countries that have nuclear triad capabilities, and India is one of them. Just like how there are very, very few who have anti-satellite outer space missile technology, and India is one of them. So you find India in almost all of these elite categories of missile technology at the moment.
So that's interesting. So fire anti-satellite missiles, what are the platforms that are currently available in the world? And what kind of range do they have? Can they go to geosynchronous orbits or just low Earth orbits?
So if I'm not mistaken, many of them typically tend to operate in the lower orbits, but there are some orbit-to-orbit missiles as well, which can be fired from up in the atmosphere itself to take out the enemy's satellites. So here, once again, it's not the destructive capabilities of these anti-satellite missiles that we need to worry about. It's the importance of the targets, that the satellites themselves are what we use for day-to-day usage today. I mean, every basic bit of communication in our daily lives is dependent on satellites in some way. So it's not like a nuclear explosion where we are worried that it might kill 2 billion or 3 billion people. It's that it will take out critical infrastructure up in space. So I'm not too sure what the latest, because, once again, many of these numbers keep changing, right? So it's very difficult for us to keep track of that. I tend to keep track of the strategic aspects of this rather than the engineering specifications per se. But here, once again, the big problem is that it will plunge us into darkness rather than having a high fatality rate or whatever.
So again, coming back to drones, I'm not sure whether you are familiar. For the last few weeks, or maybe over a little bit over a month, most of the US high concentrated military facilities and major cities have been overwhelmed with drones that are unidentified. So they call them drones, but most people call them UFOs. Some people say those are ETs, like extraterrestrials. Some people say it's their own government programs that are secret, and some are simply saying it's Chinese drones. What do you make of it? I mean, having a drone flying over top secret military facilities, that the drone and the people on the ground, especially the higher ranking military officials on those military bases in US, they don't even know what's going on. And if they call somebody in their military branches to figure out, are you guys doing this? And they don't get an answer. And even FBI can't figure it out. What's the secrecy, and what could these be? What's your take on that?
So I have 2 or 3 options, right? 2 or 3 different theories. Now we can, of course, there's the UFO extraterrestrial theory as well. There's this really funny book called Little Green Men, written by a writer called Christopher Buckley. He's the guy who wrote Thank You for Smoking and a number of different political satire books. So he writes a lot of political satire books. Little Green Men is about a US PSYOPs program, which is allocated, it's created to give people the impression that aliens exist and that UFOs roam around the world and all that. So the people actually don't rise, and the people kind of stick to their lives and stay in their zone and bubble and all that. I'm not too sure how, the US government would like it if all of us believed that there was this alien technology available, and that the Americans were somehow some kind of special country in the viewpoint of these aliens, where the Pentagon has like an old spaceship and stuff like that. So the idea that aliens exist, and the conspiracy theory might itself be the conspiracy theory. That's one, where we are made to believe that aliens are around and all that. The second is, look, there are lots of experimental drones coming up these days. As I said, 3D printing has now made it possible for anybody in a garage to churn out all kinds of experimental drone designs with all kinds of new capabilities. It's basically complete anarchy out there in terms of drone innovation, design innovation, and tech innovation. As you know, this is just anybody now has the ability to experiment in their garage and come up with all kinds of things. So is this because of that? I don't know. Maybe. A third option, as you were saying, maybe that is that aliens are actually taking over, and these are alien craft and all that. But once again, look, if some life form could travel all those light years to get here without detection, are they really going to be so bad that our phone cameras can now capture them? That's one thing I've never understood about UFOs, right? Where these UFOs are apparently advanced and stealthy enough to circumvent all the most sophisticated defensive systems. But you and I from our terrace have seen flying saucers, and we've taken pictures of them.
So
and
in
all
that case,
Yeah.
in this channel, but in Sinhala, so you might not understand. So we have done over 30 hours of debates and 30 hours of research as separate podcasts on how this entire UFO scenario from few thousand years before Christ to today, what's happening today. And most of the things you said are the preliminary questions that we get from skeptics as well as people who are new to this paradigm. So all those have been answered to a certain extent, which are really, plausible and most certainly debatable. But the thing is, when you take the drones that are being displayed above these cities right now, they can stay afloat for more than 12 hours. And none of the technologies, the signal jamming technologies, would work against them. Just they have tried everything, but the only thing they didn't try was shoot them down. So I don't know why that is happening. Maybe they could send up a jet and see actually what's happening. So this had happened in 1997 also. We call them Phoenix lights. I'll send you a documentary. So that's in English. So it will, if you can explain that, there are certain things you cannot explain. Like there are thousands of incidents, and out of those incidents, thousands of incidents, about 50 to 100 incidents, there is no explanation other than to believe. I'm not talking about aliens, other than to believe that there is something out there that we don't understand. But thousands of other, most cases, like 80%, 90% of the cases can be explained. Either it's a weather phenomena or a experimental aircraft, or simply that our eyes and our senses are fooling us to believe that something is there. So those can be explained. But that those little incidents, that few hundred incidents, we cannot actually find an explanation as of now. So that's where all these, and there are a lot of evidence also for different government cover-ups, and not just US, it's on Russia, China, Brazil, or UK, France, everywhere. It's everywhere basically. So we don't know much.
So are you like a big Eric von Daniken fan with the Chariot of the Gods and all that?
I wouldn't say a fan. I'm a skeptic. I always try to be skeptical on these subjects. But when I am presented with evidence that cannot be, debunked easily as well as scientifically, so I tend to open my mind and see what's happening. So in that case, when you look at this whole, from last year onwards, the activity has increased. There were several congressional hearings where people who were afraid before to come out and speak about this stuff. The pilots, commercial pilots as well, military pilots, intelligence officials, not just in US. There are pilots who have seen this stuff in Sri Lankan Airlines. They are not willing to talk about it because they are thinking that they would be ridiculed on that. There are.
Yeah, but don't you feel that the UFO debate and the alien debate are separate? So I think UFOs obviously are real, as in terms of, if we were to just look at unidentified flying objects, I think there's absolutely no doubt that that is real. But it's the alien question that kind of puts me off a bit.
For that, I will send you some clips. I'm not saying you to believe that there are aliens, but there are there are a lot of conspiracy theories as well as unexplainable situations and a lot of cover-ups. I mean, people have died over this, and those all these evidence are anecdotal, and nobody came up with a biological sample or this is an alien ship sample, this is a metal sample from an alien ship, right? There are stuff like that also hanging around, and people are doing experiments on them, and they have found some elements that are not usually found on Earth, that can be chemically 3D printed like that, technologies like that were so many decades behind. I mean, in 80s they have found this, and now only today we are getting into 3D printing. So how on earth that happened 30 years ago? So that's the kind of problems we are facing with, and nobody is confirming any of it. So that's why all this stigma around this issue is there, as well as nobody can provide an exact answer. So it's exciting.
I do believe in aliens, by the way. I just want to say, I do believe in aliens. I just believe that they would do a better job covering their tracks when they come here.
No, I think one of our hypotheses is that if they want to show themselves, that's what they are doing. I mean, when they won't show themselves, they can show themselves, and there's a lot of historical background and incidents on this, especially when it comes to when we are very close to nuclear war or a nuclear activity, then we see a lot of presence around that. So it's kind of, this is where it gets science fiction as well as science fact. So yeah, I would love to educate you a bit on that, and maybe we can have a separate discussion on that someday. So let's so let's come back to the missiles and stuff. So Sri Lankan military, we are one of the poorest militaries in the world. We have to accept that, and we have jets and other instruments that are way older than the other regional or other contemporary militaries. North Korea even has updated tools and instruments than us compared to the rest of the world even. So where do we stand, and how are we going? First problem is, do we need an upgrade to our military defense systems? If so, why? And where are we in terms of technology-wise to the world?
See, technology-wise, obviously, as a small country, we are never going to be on the same level as the larger countries, right? But once again, I would like to emphasize the point that it's not the technology that matters, it's how you use that technology which matters. So when we say that we're a poor army and that even North Korea has better and all that, look, let's not forget that there are only a handful of countries in the entire world which can boast of the kind of military success that we can. So if you asked me to place Sri Lanka on a list, I would say in the top 3, because there are only about 2 or 3 countries in the entire world which have actually won wars, and we're among them. So it doesn't matter whether we have 5th generation fighter jets and whether we have intercontinental ballistic missiles and all that. The important thing is that we are an army that knows, an armed forces in general, right? Our military forces in general, we know how to win. While many of these countries with extremely advanced weaponry and all that, they have no idea how to win, which is why they never actually win. And I'm not just talking about defeating the adversary. If you look at, when was the last time you heard of somebody dying because of a landmine or something in the north? There were huge anti-mining operations done once the LTT was finished off. They are, by the way, the West, the advanced West, with billions of dollars in its defense budget, they are still removing the mines from Bosnia. People are estimating that the current Russia-Ukraine war, once it ends, will take at least 75 to 85 years for all those landmines to be removed, while we did it in the space of like 1 or 2 years, right? So look at the way in which we adapted, where in the 90s, how many military experts said that the LTT could not be defeated militarily? Everybody said that the LTT could not be defeated militarily, right? Even Sri Lankan experts were claiming that. But look at the way in which we were able to adapt our doctrine and adapt our tactics and adapt our thinking in order to become highly maneuverable, in order to start becoming far more flexible, where we we took the LTT by surprise by how flexible we were and how we were now fighting like them asymmetrically, and we basically overwhelmed them. So technologically, I wouldn't want to play. To me, it doesn't really matter. We could be last in the world, even of course, we're not last in the world technologically, but we know how to use the technology that we have. Let me put it that way.
So, is there a need to modernize?
There's always a need to modernize. So there's always a need to get more drones, more manufacturing capabilities, and it's always good for us to keep up with that. Once again, as you rightly pointed out, we are not that well equipped with the latest technology and all that. But if you raise the defense budget, then politically, how viable is that going to be, right? For you to buy all these weapons and all that, you have to raise the defense budget. And then you get the usual rhetoric of, oh, this could go to education, this could go to healthcare. You know how the political drill here works, right? So we are never going to be in a position, unfortunately, where we can call ourselves a modernized army by international standards. We are simply not big enough, and our economy is simply not big enough for us to ever be able to claim that. But what we can claim is that we are among the best in the world at using what we have and adapting to the battlefield itself, which is the real test of how we use technology, not how well we build technology in a lab, if that makes sense.
So, if we are to modernize in a cost-effective manner, I would say we should think of homegrown drones and robotics. What do you think?
Yeah, certainly. So I think that's the direction in which all small countries will go in the future. Robotics, drones, 3D printing technology,
and maybe cyber security, like cyber warfare also.
Yeah, I mean, so cyber warfare, you could argue, is already a mainstream domain of warfare, right? So if we look at almost all conflicts in the world today, including the Russia-Ukraine war, the cyber aspect is as damaging to the Ukrainian and Russian economies as the actual physical attacks themselves. So, but cyber is something that most countries, particularly from 2007 onwards, have realized needs to be a part of the government military infrastructure. Whereas for many of these things like drones and robotics and all that, there will first be a wave of voluntary entrepreneurs and researchers who start getting into the mix first. And it's only then that it will start getting scaled up. So obviously Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and all that have their own robotics division and have their own drone division and all that. But in the heat of the moment, in the heat of a battle, kind of like how the Ukrainians improvised their own drones and sort of gave themselves a much bigger chance than they ought to have, the adaptability comes when you have young people in your country who are well versed in the engineering of these things.
Great. So just to wrap up this first session of our military and geopolitical podcast, we will be doing episodes a little bit longer than this in the upcoming episode, but today we just wanted to get you a feel of how we are doing this webinar podcast, as well as what kind of information we are sharing there. So just to start it off on a good note and to share some knowledge, especially in terms of the technologies that have been used in current global warfare. But again, we are just enthusiasts about this subject. We are not promoting war or not promoting any military engagements on all these countries, or we are not taking sides. We are just reviewing what's out there and what are the capabilities of these systems, so we can learn from it and we can improve our own understanding, as well as our own let's say creativity, as well as if there's a need. Okay, so we know we have a base of knowledge to move forward from. So I hope that need would never arise, but you can never say never. So Nilan, I would like to give you some closing comments regarding today's session and what we would be talking about in the upcoming sessions. So you can go have a go at that.
Yeah, so in terms of military technology itself, we could talk about fighter jets, maybe running the audience through, because you hear, right, 5th generation fighter jets, 6th generation, but what do these generations actually mean? What impact does it have on the battlefield? So we could do that. We could do a maritime version of that where we discuss the world's kind of prominent warships and stuff like that. And obviously, while I'm not an expert on the specific engineering of it, I would be able to tell you what the strategic impact on the battlefield has been and how is geopolitics being affected by it and all that. Maybe we can discuss Latin American drug cartels or an episode on Syria. We could do an entire episode on lasers and all that, to be honest. Energy directed weapons itself is such a big field. Nuclear submarines, right? Or an entire thing on space and space warfare and how space warfare. You know what? We should do an episode on what war maybe 30 years from now or 40 years from now would potentially look like based on the existing technology that we have. Like, so I wrote an article a few years ago on invisibility technology and how the Americans and the Russians were working on almost like a Harry Potter kind of invisibility cloak. And since then, there have been a lot of developments as well, where the technologies become even more sophisticated, where you can actually put on a cloak and you become invisible, right, by refracting the light and all that. So there are lots of cool new technological things that are coming in. Geopolitically, once again, we can discuss the geopolitics of the Russia-Ukraine war, what Russia's and Ukraine's justifications are. Israel-Palestine, maybe, if your audience is interested, where we go into the justifications of both. So I like dissecting these big problems where we look at the justifications of both sides. Rather than trying to support one over the other, we give the audience the Israeli perspective and the Palestinian perspective, and we let them decide. We can give them the Russian perspective and the Ukrainian perspective and let them decide. So the topics that we discuss geopolitically hopefully will be more along those lines, where we look at both sides.
Great. So you heard it from Nilan. So we will be coming up with some exciting episodes on various subjects related to military technology as well as geopolitics. So this is a series. We have designed this in a way, we have decided on to do this. Why we are doing this episode, I would say that we wanted to heighten the knowledge of the Sri Lankan community regarding what's happening in the world. So it's not just all these problems are very complex. There are no simple solutions to any of these. So to get that feel and to educate you on that, so we would ultimately be able to make collective decisions as a country as well in our way forward in the political and other arenas. So thank you, Nilan, for today's session, and looking forward to connect with you next week, and we will be continuing this session.
Absolutely. This has been a lot of fun, and all the tangents have been a lot of fun as well. So on a parting note, I would like to remind you again that I am an expert on cryptozoology as well. So you can teach me about aliens, and you can hear my views on.
So you will be getting a lot of content from me to refer from. Good. Up to next week, as well as I would like to invite you to our other podcast called Manasgata, where we specifically discuss paranormal activity, UFOs, cryptozoology, and other stuff. So see you there.
Awesome.
Okay, take care, buddy.
Awesome.